Opening the center grants significant development potential and pawn presence, instantly contesting central squares. Instantly contesting the center, black mirrors white's ambition, setting the stage for an open, dynamic game where each pawn's skirmish dictates space. Developing the knight to f3 directly challenges black's central pawn and prepares for kingside castling, a fundamental principle of opening play. Developing the knight to c6 is a classic response, offering robust central defense and preparing for piece activity on the queen side. Asserting pressure on the knight, this move prepares for a potential pawn advance and dictates the game's early direction. Challenging the bishop's position immediately asks white if they want to maintain the pin or retreat, dictating black's subsequent development. Doubling black's pawns creates a structural weakness that white can exploit long-term. Doubling pawns here, though it opens the d-file, disrupts black's queenside structure and may create long-term weaknesses. Securing the monarch's safety is paramount after the piece exchange, creating an immediate defensive posture. Weakening the kingside pawn shield for such a marginal gain risks future attacks. Seizing central territory aggressively, white immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens lines for piece activity. Opening the e-file, black strengthens central pawn control and prepares to develop the bishop. Recapturing with the knight immediately centralizes it, eyeing the king side and creating potential outpost opportunities. Challenging white's central pawn dominance, black boldly advances, aiming to disrupt white's knight and gain queenside space. Retreating the knight from the pawn chain avoids immediate recapture, aiming for a less congested queenside and potential central influence later. Trading queens here abandons any ambition for an attack and plunges into an endgame where doubled pawns on the c-file will be a significant weakness. Recapturing the rook opens the d-file for your own rook, aiming for active piece play. Developing the bishop to an active diagonal prepares for potential pawn advances and central influence. Reclaiming the knight's position opens lines for development, preparing to contest central influence and eyeing potential weak squares. Castling queenside now creates immediate pawn tension down the c-file, forcing white to clarify the central structure. Developing the bishop aims to contest the central files and prepare for kingside activity, eyeing potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Developing the bishop to d6 now strengthens the center and eyes the weak c-pawn, a prudent regrouping maneuver. Securing the bishop's diagonal opens lines for rook activity. Centralizing the bishop exchanges material, but relieves the pressure on black's isolated queenside pawns. Recapturing the knight opens the d-file and sets up potential piece play, but temporarily weakens white's pawn structure. A defensive repositioning. The knight aims to bolster the pawn chain's integrity while seeking a more active square later. Securing the rook's active potential by connecting the rooks and preparing for future action on the central files. Probing the knight's position with the bishop immediately challenges its centralizing influence. Simplifying the position opens the rook file and initiates a trade that should lead to a more manageable endgame for white. Centralizing the rook on the now open d-file solidifies black's control, preparing for a potential central pawn push and better piece coordination. Solidifying pawn structure before potentially challenging black's central influence. Developing the bishop to a more active square, aiming to coordinate with the remaining pieces and potentially contest the central files. Consolidating central presence, preparing to contest the open d-file with renewed purpose and potentially exploit any lingering pawn weaknesses. Navigating the center with the knight offers flexibility, potentially eyeing weaknesses on the queen side while avoiding immediate confrontation. Bringing the king towards the center initiates a subtle endgame maneuver, preparing for potential pawn advances. Shifting the rook to the f-file prepares to contest control of it, potentially supporting a future pawn advance or piece maneuver. Initiating pawn storm aims to disrupt black's queenside harmony and gain space. Securing the queenside pawns offers a modest positional foothold, preparing for potential pawn advances later. Anchoring a knight centrally like this can suffocate black's queenside expansion possibilities. Securing that queenside pawn structure solidifies black's foothold, preventing immediate white infiltration and preparing potential queenside expansion. Gaining space on the kingside opens avenues for your pieces and restricts black's development. Shifting the rook to the 7th rank supports a potential pawn push while maintaining defensive coverage. Seeking to redeploy the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting pawn advances. The knight boldly ventures to e5, seeking to disrupt white's pawn structure and claim central influence. Pushing the pawn forward creates crucial space on the kingside, potentially enabling a later breakthrough or supporting advanced pieces. Controlling the queenside, this pawn advance challenges white's central space and aims to disrupt their harmony. Solidifying the queenside pawn chain, while acknowledging the impending passed pawn threat on the file. Securing the knight on c6 prevents white's pawn advance and prepares to contest the open files. Asserting central presence, the knight endeavors to liberate itself and potentially harass black's weak kingside pawn structure. Reigniting central influence, black's knight ventures into a promising outpost, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially exploit the weakened kingside. 26. Nf5 bravely infiltrates the queenside, eyeing the weak f6 square and creating potential for a powerful kingside attack. Sacrificing the bishop opens lines for the rook and aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside. Pawn structure fractures, opening lines for your knights to exploit the weakened kingside. Securing the kingside pawn structure, this move aims to prevent immediate pawn advances from white. Solidifying the central pawn chain and preparing for potential pawn advances is key to white's developing strategy. Repositioning the knight to the queenside aims to contest white's central space and pressure the weakened b2 pawn. Asserting control of the central squares by advancing the pawn chain now prevents black's knight from reaching its desired outpost. Re-establishing knightly outposts near the center always creates exciting possibilities for piece activity. Unlocking the c-file for rook infiltration becomes the immediate priority here. Re-establishing knight presence on c6 solidifies black's central control and prepares for potential breakthroughs. Seizing the open file, white's knight boldly enters enemy territory, threatening immediate disruption. This maneuver aims to disrupt white's central control, eyeing the advanced knight on a4 with potential harassment. Securing the open rook file now solidifies white's positional advantage. Reclaiming the d-file with the rook solidifies black's central presence and prepares to challenge white's pawn chain. Opening the queenside flank creates an immediate territorial threat. Embracing the open files, this capture sacrifices pawn structure for a dynamic queenside presence, aiming to disrupt white's coordination. Capturing the pawn on a4 opens a crucial file for your rook, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure. Regaining the pawn with the knight stabilizes the queenside pawn structure and prepares potential counterplay. A bold pawn thrust liberating the rook and attacking enemy lines. Relocating the knight to the edge promises it better squares, aiming to disturb white's pawn chain. Securing the king is paramount as the queens are off, preparing for the eventual pawn race. The knight infiltrates towards the queenside, potentially disrupting white's pawn structure and seeking more active squares. Solidifying the c-file's control establishes a robust defensive posture against black's persistent knight sorties. A daring gambit to disrupt the central structure, sacrificing material for king activity. Relocating the king to safety prepares for potential complications on the queenside, while solidifying a defensive posture. Capturing the pawn exposes your king to a dangerous chase across the board. Now white's knight has active targets. Reasserting knight activity on the queenside opens up new avenues for attack or defense. Repositioning the knight to g3 creates attacking potential on the kingside, forcing white to react. Repositioning the knight to d5 aims to neutralize black's active knight and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around the black king. Pushing this pawn further risks overextension, but aims to disrupt white's queenside pawns and perhaps open a diagonal for the knight. Activating the king is paramount as the queens are off, and it's time to initiate a more active endgame setup. Propelling the knight forward with pawn support, black initiates a daring attack on white's central pawns. Driving the king forward, the monarch aggressively joins the fray, aiming to capitalize on any exposed weaknesses in black's pawn structure. A valiant defense initiates a desperate counterplay on the kingside, hoping to disrupt white's advancing pawns. Securing the pawn opens a diagonal for the rook and creates immediate threats. The knight's sortie aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, but its outpost on f1 seems isolated and potentially vulnerable. Clearing a path for the rook to become more active on the open files offers immediate counterplay. Unleashing a desperate check, black forces the white king to abandon its safe square, exposing it to further danger in the center. King exposed, you're chasing a phantom knight, an inviting mate. The rook's infiltration to the first rank is a potent threat, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and create mating nets. Opening the f-file might reignite tactical complications around the black king. A desperate check, hoping to disrupt white's advancing pawns and king's safety. The king's excursion into enemy territory is over. It's time for retreat before further harm. The king's exposed position demands immediate attention before black solidifies his forces. Activating the rook on the open file to challenge black's king's safety. The rook's journey to the kingside hints at a desperate attempt to stir up some counterplay. Reactivating the white queen's rook, this offers a potent flanking attack along the 7th rank. A bold knight fork, seeking to disrupt white's kingside pawn storm and recapture material. King's desperate scramble for safety towards the queenside amidst overwhelming material and pawn weaknesses. Re-establishing the rook's influence on the crucial open file, black aims to exploit white's somewhat exposed monarch. Sacrificing the rook opens a clear path for the king to escape the dangerous check, initiating a critical pawn race. Exposing the king to such a powerful rook, and knight battery spells disaster. Sacrificing the rook opens a crucial diagonal for the king's rampage. The black king, exposed and hunted across the board, must now evade the pursuing rook's dangerous infiltration. Chasing the king into the open board creates dynamic imbalances, offering chances for aggressive play.